Welcome to Career Tools. This week, continuation of our series, Choosing the Company to Work For, Reputation. Here we go. Folks, our 2014 schedule is up on the website. We have over 100 days of conferences planned, all over the United States and almost all over the world. Please come and look. People repeatedly tell us our conferences are the best management or communications training they've ever been to. And for those of you who are thinking about broadening your network and thinking about companies that you may want to work for someday, you'll run into some good ones at the conference. That's a connection between conferences and choosing a company to work for. This is the fourth part of our series on choosing a company.
Yep.
We've covered compensation, company values, industry stability. I love the industry stability one. So many people don't get that. Today we're going to talk about the company's reputation, which is huge, right? I was just talking at the conference about goodwill, about the importance of corporate goodwill and about individual goodwill. There's an old saying about you can't go wrong buying IBM.
Yep.
In the same way that having IBM on your resume never hurts. Now, why did you bring up IBM? Is it because you have IBM on your resume? In fact, who's the only person in this room that has both Procter & Gamble and IBM on their resume?
That would be me.
That would be you.
And I did use it as an example throughout the cast, but I only used it as an example because they say you can't go wrong buying IBM.
Yeah.
There are a multitude of very good companies.
Absolutely.
So don't think that just because I wrote IBM through this cast, you can only go work for IBM.
And I bet you, our audience has a lot of technical people in it, and there are some people who probably poo-poo IBM a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. Too big, too stodgy, and so on. And what they don't know is the first company ever to put anything in Silicon Valley was IBM.
Yeah, and they have a technical track so that you can be promoted without having to be a manager,
I think the top of it is a fellow, an IBM fellow, and those guys are like almost Nobel Prize winners, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, really smart. Okay, so what are we going to talk about?
So choose the company with the best reputation, if you've got a choice.
Well, really, we're not going for third or fourth. We're going for best.
No, we're going for best. Look for their reputation in the business press.
Yeah, not hard.
Look for their local reputation, and look for their reputation in what you're going to be doing.
Right, in your part, in your specialty, your specialism.
Exactly.
Okay, good. So, not surprising, we say choose the company with the best reputation. All of the things being equal, right? Always choose the company with the best reputation. I assume, though, we want to say, for the record, for the billionth time on Manager Tools and Career Tools, it's
never equal.
Yeah, everything is never equal, right?
Likelihood of it being equal is zero.
Right.
So.
Okay.
Early in your career, you do want to go for companies with better reputations if you have the choice. And there's, if it's a difference between 5K in salary that some company is going to pay that hasn't got a great reputation, and 5K less to work for a company that does have a great reputation, you want to go for the one with a better reputation because you don't have any personal reputation. You don't have a track record of getting results. And so the company reputation will help buoy you up in your early career. And especially if you're likely to move companies quite often, that's, you're not going to have time to build up a good reputation in your company over 5 or 10 years. So you need the company reputation to help you.
I just had a conversation with a very good friend of mine, an old West Point roommate, whose son transitioned. He lives in Silicon Valley, and his son transitioned, and he went to a huge technical company, and he was actually looking for a small company. I provided him the interviewing series. He was actually looking for a small company, and I said, look, I told his dad, it was John Hoffman, actually. I said, wherever he wants to go. I said, and I think, look, if he goes to a small company, it's harder to go to a big company later unless they get acquired. But spend a couple of years at a big company. They're not as bad as most people think. You and I did that. I did it at Procter. He did it at Applied Materials. And absolutely, the kids saying now, right call, good call.
Yeah. They have more money for training budget. They have a lot. There's a bigger company internal network for you to learn from.
Yeah.
There's a lot of benefits to going for a big company at the beginning.
And when we say big, folks, to some degree that's a proxy for reputation. We certainly understand there are small companies with great reputations, even more so now thanks to technology and startups and so on. So please don't over misrepresent that as being, you need to go to a big company, because you don't. There are small companies. I will say, if you started a small company without reputation because you like the vibe of that, and then you end up going to work at a big company when you're 35, and you don't know how to work at a big company.
Culture shock.
It's more than culture shock. You will be ineffective. And it will show. There will be 35-year-olds 2 levels down who can get more done in the organization, who don't have to use their role power because they know how to work in a big company. I'm not saying that's the reason to choose a company based on reputation, but it's one of those things that people forget.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then,
the personal reputation thing. I just want to mention that for just a second. I think I've shared the story before about my choice that when I got out of the Army, I had 3 different offers very quickly and had to make a choice, and I chose Procter & Gamble because of the reputation. And I got to tell you something, folks. The 2 smartest things I ever did in my professional career, overall, in my career in terms of managing where I went to work, other than starting my own company, although I'll get to that in a second, were West Point and Procter & Gamble. And the reason I chose both is because they would not ever hurt me. I didn't know enough. I knew I didn't know enough. And look, if you're a college senior and you're listening to this, you don't know enough. You don't. You think you do, but you don't. Okay? When I was 20, I thought I knew what was going on. No, that's not true. I didn't know what was going on. When I was 25, I thought I knew what was going on. And then when I turned 30, I realized at 25 I didn't know anything. And then when I turned 35, I realized I really didn't know anything when I was 30, but at 35, anyway. That was the first thing. Procter & Gamble has never hurt me. It's a big plus, a huge plus in my career, no question about it. I mean, people actually said, hey, Mark, he worked at Procter. Oh, okay, right? It's a signaling effect. We talked about signaling effects before at Career Tools. You mentioned the point about personal reputation. The reason I chose to go to work at my own company when I got fired was because I knew I had a personal reputation. I had built one. I had had long enough to have had built one. It had only been, 10 or 11 years that I'd been in the workforce, but that was long enough. And considering a corporate reputation versus your own reputation matters. It does. And you don't, as you say, you don't have it early on in your career. Okay?
And let's not just say, though, you can get a job at IBM or any of the Fortune 100 companies and then slack off and get no results on your own.
Right.
So it doesn't matter who is on your resume. You have to get results as well. And every company makes hiring mistakes.
Yeah, there are jerks at IBM and Procter & Gamble and GE and Walmart and Oracle and Microsoft and Google and HP and Royal Dutch Shell, so on. Yeah,
all of those companies. So, and if you have no personal results on your resume, it will be quite obvious to a recruiter that you're trading on the company name and you don't have any results of your own.
The other thing is that at a large company, while at small companies there's all this energy, and we don't disagree, a lot of energy, a lot of chances to do a lot of different things. But those things you're doing are on a much smaller scale. And so you're not learning how big companies market if you're doing the marketing stuff for a small company putting out a new product. On the other hand, when you go to a big company, there's an expectation that you're going to do it well. And they know how to do it, or they have a way of doing it. And they're going to teach you how they do it. And generally speaking, somebody who's spent a year in marketing at a large company may not have done as much, but understands more than somebody who's going to work at a small company and says, oh, as an additional thing, you got to do some marketing stuff. If you don't know what you're doing in marketing and there's nobody there to teach you, you're not going to learn a ton. You're going to feel like you learned a ton because you're doing it all for the first time, and you feel like you're learning when you make mistakes and have to get better. And again, this is not a recommendation for a big company because there are plenty of small companies with fabulous reputations. But if you're at a big company, they're going to expect you to do well because they know they have a reputation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then later in your career, you'll have the track record of results. So you can maybe weight reputation more lightly.
You built your network.
Exactly.
Right.
And if you have 2 equal offers, which we're going to say still won't happen, you can choose the company with the best reputation. There's nothing wrong with a company with a resume that is Fortune 100 companies all the way through.
Right.
But if you get to 20 years into your career and you think, I've worked for big companies, I fancy a small company, or I fancy working in the third sector, or I fancy doing something, working in a startup, you probably have more.
You have more wisdom to make that choice.
Absolutely.
You have more reputation to trade on that will help that small company. And at this point now, your reputation matters as much as the corporate reputation where you're working.
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's definitely less risk for doing that later on.
Okay, so how do we find out about reputation?
Okay, so we want to look for reputation in the business press rather than
the social press?
The social press, People magazine or whatever.
Right.
So clearly, if you go and work somewhere, you are working in a division or in a location, and their reputation matters the local reputation matters, and we'll get to that in a minute. But on your resume, it's the big picture reputation that matters.
Right.
So you want to be looking for the company name overall. So
Right.
the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times have company summaries with financial data, recent articles, and all of the press releases. Fortune has the best companies to work for and the top 100 companies in different areas that they publish once a year. If you're still, I looked on Hoover's and it's all paid now.
It's still paid.
It used to be free. But if you're at university or near one, you can probably get access to that.
Yeah, look, we ought to probably do some more to help people understand how to research. The problem with that, we stay away from it generally because it's timely rather than timeless, e.g. Hoover's now being paid, right? I'll tell you what, though, I used to read the 100 best companies to work for, and now it's included in Fortune magazine, but it used to be a book. And I remember reading about Hewitt the first time, and Hewitt for a long time was a company that I didn't want to compete against, and they were indirectly in my space because they were so good and the reputation was so good. And twice I consulted them, and they blew me away with their professionalism. Yeah, but look, 100 best companies to work for, which you can go back and get 3, 4, 5 years ago. Absolutely a great place to start. And I actually think it's actually longer than 100 companies to work for. And what's interesting is if you're fairly new in your career, they give you some insight into their methodology, what they look at, what's important. They talk about benefits. They talk about culture. They interview people. And you can get more detailed information if you'll go online rather than just a 20-page article or whatever. And they list them by industry as well.
Yeah, they do. There's a lot of separate.
Very helpful.
Yeah, I think on the online version, you can sort the different columns. So you can sort them by value and industry and a bunch of different things.
Yeah, and now look, when we say the business press, folks, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Fortune magazine, The Economist, perhaps less so, it tends to be more political. Forbes magazine in the U.S., although not great. It used to be Business Week, but not great. Bloomberg Business Week, not great. You'll notice that if you've been around a few years, they're a lot thinner than they used to be, which is a bad sign. And then look, there are thousands of websites. Again, we'll provide some guidance on that in the future, but you just need to look around. Now, one of the things that I noticed a number of years ago that I thought was interesting was the people that went on late night talk show hosts. I just threw everybody a curveball. The people that went on late night talk show shows, I couldn't understand why they were there. And then I realized it's all PR.
Oh, yeah.
Jay Leno doesn't reach out or Jimmy Kimmel doesn't reach out and get somebody that they're interested in. They don't get somebody who's a second rater from a movie that everybody liked. They get the star of the movie if they're a top talk show. And the morning shows as well. And it's all PR. Yeah. They're fielding thousands of requests. I want my guy on your show. And they cherry pick the ones that they think will do the best ratings.
We get 2, 3 requests a day.
Yeah, exactly. To be on the show.
To be on the show.
Folks, don't request to be on the show. Okay? And what that is, that's PR. And if you're not careful, I remember I did this when I was young, I would say, oh, that company's interesting because I'm hearing a lot about them. You're only hearing a lot about them if it lasts for 2 or 3 weeks because they are driving public relations in order to get you to think about them, to favorably consider the new product or their new service. Much like the way, at least in today's world, 2013, Apple has been somewhat famous over the last 5 years anyway, for driving a lot of attention around their product launches, okay? And a lot of companies have sort of glommed onto that idea. I actually think before Apple did it, the video game companies were doing it. I remember Call of Duty do that a lot and other fields. Okay,
Publishing did it.
Yeah, publishing did it, yeah, absolutely. Here's the point on that, folks. You don't want to simply do a 2-week search because it will be skewed the way if you watch a couple of nights of late night talk, you'll think, oh, George Clooney is always on. He's not. He's only on when he's doing a movie. And frankly, there are very few people who return on a regular basis unless they're doing something for themselves. It's all selfish. It's a symbiotic, selfish relationship. Be careful about being 22 and reading a couple of articles about Google and say, oh, Google's great. Nothing against Google, guys. Great company, great reputation. Clearly a reputation company that would be good on your resume.
Yeah.
But be careful about that. And you need to establish a habit of looking for things over time so that those spikes will go away and you'll see the companies that get mentioned on a routine basis. Now, I'm amazed at the number of people who don't say, I had a guy say, yeah, I've always wanted to work for Siemens, the big German engineering company. Siemens actually was the first company ever to start a corporate sponsored R&D facility in Germany. Quite a while ago. They have great history. It'd be a great company to have on your resume. And I said, oh, and he says, well, I've applied a few times, but I can't seem to get hired. I said, okay, who competes with them? He said, well, I haven't thought about that. He says, how do you find that out? I said, well, look, I'm not Wendy. Wendy can find anything out on the internet, but I'll tell you what I can do. I can say, who competes with Siemens? And I did it on my phone, and I got a list.
Yeah.
Right?
Just like that.
And by the way, 2 other companies, they didn't have Siemens' reputation, but they had a good reputation. I'd be willing to bet that you could Google corporate reputation and you could find a whole ton of stuff.
Absolutely, you could. Yeah.
And then by doing that and becoming more exposed and then thinking, okay, I really want to work in this industry, you're going to be able to drive down to more details. And again, this is where probably not as possible for a young person because your network isn't in place. But I got to tell you something. If your friends are interviewing on college campus now and they go to work at X or Y or Z, stay in touch with them. Not because you want to just find out about their corporate experience, but because you want to be their friend and you're building your network. It's way better to build your network when it's already warm and keep it warm rather than letting it go cold and trying to rebuild it. But why not? If somebody goes to IBM, if somebody goes to Google, if somebody goes to Walmart, why not stay in touch with them simply because you want to learn from them about the company that they're at? So.
Absolutely.
And that goes to the point that I think you were going to make about you don't want to try to do this 2 days before an interview, right? Because you may in fact catch spikes that would be misleading.
Yeah. I mean, if you catch it the day that a company is sued, there's a judgment against a company in court, you could think, oh my God, IBM's going down. There's no way it is, and the companies have judgments for them and against them all the time.
Yeah, and if you don't avoid the spikes, you're also gonna catch negative spikes.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Any large company, and by the way, there are plenty of small companies with great reputations that we like enormously, I think, including ours. But if you allow yourself to be focused on spikes, which the only way around that is to establish a pattern of looking at educating yourself through the business press and then through osmosis, getting bits of reputation as you go along. You're also going to get negative spikes. For instance, if you don't know it, big companies are targets for people. And every big company has enough people in it to make mistakes. And they all have environmental mistakes and they all are less green than some people want. And if you're not careful, you'll end up getting 2 ends of the spectrum, really great and really bad. And at any given time, any company with a good reputation will get bad press. And be cautious about that because the people who are throwing those companies underneath the bus aren't you. Now, you may share some interests with them. Perhaps you're an environmental person and you really care about a green future. Great, that's great. We all want a planet to live on for thousands and thousands of years. I want my kids to have a great earth to live on. Maybe you're very into recyclables. That could be something. Maybe you're very into politics and you want to know how a company's leaders tend to feel about the political arena. There's nothing wrong with that either. But just recognize that when you read positives, if you're only focused for a short period of time, you're going to see positives and negatives. And it's the long wave thinking that's a better way to do this.
Absolutely.
Okay? Now, you mentioned something about local reputation as well.
Yeah. So the global reputation is what really matters on your resume.
Yes.
But we'd be remiss if we didn't tell you to also investigate the local reputation. So you want to reach out to your network because you're less likely to be able to read this stuff. It's probably something that you'll hear from people who are local, but find out what's said about the location you're looking at and the division that you're going to be working for. One reason for this is when a large company has fairly recently bought a smaller company in the last
5 years,
5 years or so, there can be a very different culture and atmosphere in the locations that used to belong to the small company than used to belong to the big company.
Right.
When I worked for IBM, I worked in a location that had been bought, and despite the fact that IBM's policy is The day that the company transfers to IBM, everybody's an IBMer, and we start using IBM systems straight away. There was a very noticeably different atmosphere in that location than there were in the locations that had always been IBM.
Look, I see this all the time. People are a small company, they get bought. And by the way, somebody made that choice, generally speaking. They also had a choice of going out of business. The company gets bought. And there's a healthy percentage of people locally that decry the loss of the local company, while the big company wouldn't have bought it if they didn't feel it was a good investment. Now, obviously, there are layoffs because the small company had made poor choices. And folks, that's not a comment against small companies. If a company lays somebody off, it is management's, if they're smart, they're embarrassed to admit we made a mistake and we overhired, and now somebody else is going to bear the brunt of our mistake. That's the downside of bad management. That's part of the reason why we do manager tools and career tools. But oftentimes there are layoffs, and so the big company gets a bad reputation. But folks, be cautious about that, because in many cases, the small company that got bought, if they hadn't gotten bought, they would have gone out of business in many cases, not always. And there are certainly acrimonious takeovers and situations. But I'm amazed at the number of people who, in the small company, once the IBM or the ABB or the huge company, the Royal Dutch Shell or the Exxon Mobil buys them, that they complain about the big company repeatedly, and it's on their checkbook. Now, look, folks, you may have preferred the vibe at a small company. There's nothing wrong with that. We're in a small company. We think our vibe is pretty great, and you keep your mouth shut about it, right? Yeah. That said, there's nothing wrong with knowing what the local reputation is, understanding it. Yeah. Just don't immediately say, oh, I'm hearing bad things about IBM, or I'm hearing bad things about even a mid-sized company you've never heard of before, because if they just made the purchase, there's going to be some acrimony. There's going to be some people, if you'll pardon the expression, pissing and moaning over a pint, right, at the pub. So be careful out there, because again, the long wave helps you see through the spikes of positive and the spikes of negative.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then you said look for the reputation in what you'll be doing in your specialty.
Yeah, so large companies have really can have really good reputations in one thing and really bad ones in another. So for instance, Disney has a really good reputation for their theme parks, but the Disney Pixar relationship has been problematic and
at times,
and is damaging both companies' reputations in that area. So you might want to go to work for Disney Pixar, but be aware that the reputation right now is not as good as some other company that competes with them.
Right. Well, and I had somebody say to me the other day, I was mentioning Microsoft. I spent some time at Microsoft, and I said, yeah, I mean, really, it's just like three big products that makes the company go. And I got to tell you, I know a lot of people at Microsoft who are absolutely fabulous. And they said, oh, no, they got Xbox. And I said, well, Xbox doesn't make money. And they said, oh, no, Xbox makes a ton of money. And my point is not whether Xbox makes a lot of money, but rather, I promise what you think you know may very well be wrong. And this is, again, that long way of thinking. You've got to steep yourself in regular. Look, there's no joke. I've said it before. I'll say it again. I'm sure I said it at Manager Tools. There's no joke about the Wall Street Journal. And yeah, we're biased to the Journal. But guys, the Financial Times is the Pink Sheet, fabulous newspaper. The International Herald Tribune, fabulous newspaper. Okay. The Globe, is the Globe and Mail? I want to say the Globe and Mail in Toronto no, that's wrong. I'm trying to think of the Canadian one that I read. But in any event, you have to steep yourself in it for a period of time rather than just doing it for a couple of weeks, as you said about right before an interview and thinking you could know a lot, because probably what you think you know, you don't.
Yeah.
And we haven't said anything about this here, but many of you, we've mentioned public companies because so many of you know them, but there are reputations for private companies too, for engineering firms, which are always B2B, for mining firms, which are almost always B2B, for commodities firms, which are always B2B, right? Because you and I don't buy commodities, we buy refined products. And if you don't do that, then you don't know that different divisions have different reputations in different ways. So
absolutely. And you can work for a company. IBM has a consulting division, and when I worked for them, the consulting division wasn't very well regarded.
Right.
But
they were more hardware.
Yeah, exactly. Although they've They
Oh,
changed
they've
their
done
strategy
brilliantly.
and the
It's
consulting.
been one of the most impressive changes I've ever seen.
Absolutely, but
Yeah.
if you'd have looked at it when I
Yeah.
started, you might have hesitated
Yeah.
to join the consulting
Absolutely.
because the next job you went for, the person who in a consulting company, if you went to PricewaterhouseCoopers, they would know that IBM is a great company, but their consulting division doesn't have a great reputation.
Right.
So you do have to consider that kind of the local part of it.
Yeah, and guys, if you don't realize it, let's be clear. If you're in IBM Consulting, I'll give that as an example, or Google today, or Procter & Gamble, there are people who will see your resume and say, oh, we'll interview this guy. Literally on that.
Absolutely.
He's at Google, or he's at IBM Consulting, or he's at McKinsey, or he's at Goldman Sachs.
Often the direct competitors as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you have to know more. And in the next 20 years, if you're just starting your career, you're going to learn a lot more. But this is just a way to start. You've got to start paying attention. You've got to start making distinctions. Hold off on making too many big distinctions early on. Don't bet your career based on just, oh, I like my boss, right? Consider the reputation. Okay?
Absolutely.
And I think that's it, right?
Yeah, shall I sum up?
Yeah.
So choose the company with the best reputation, all other things being equal.
Which they never are.
Look for their reputation in the business press, look for their local reputation, and look for their reputation in what you'll be doing.
And folks, we don't teach what Mark or Mike or Wendy do. We teach what we know works. But I'll tell you my story. When I got out of the Army, I mentioned I had three job offers. I had a job offer for $26,600 from Procter & Gamble. No commission, no bonus. And I had an offer from Nalco Chemical, a guy named Steve Best, who I think I'm still in contact with, just a great guy. Their Water G division, industrial water treatment. And I went up to Chicago for an interview and just loved them. And Procter offered me $26,600 and Nalco offered me $39,900 and with bonus and commission. And they said, if you want to live in LA, which is where I was from, they mistakenly thought LA would be good. I didn't want to live in LA. We'll do that. And it occurred to me when I had both offers, Nalco had offered me 50% more. And 50% more is a lot with bonus and commission. This was not all of the things being equal. It wasn't even close to being equal. And I chose Procter. And I chose Procter by reputation. So this is another example of the Manager Tools, Career Tools people eating their own dog food. And I would do it again. Now, who knows what would have happened if I'd gone to Nalco. They're great people. They're very well regarded. Hard to argue with that choice as well. But I know for a fact that if I'd spent the last 30 years of my life or 28 years of my life, or however long it's been, saying, I worked at Nalco as opposed to I worked at Procter & Gamble, less doors would have been open. No offense, Steve, none at all. Please don't take it that way. But reputation matters, and we live by it, and we're very particular about our reputation. And there's a lot of things to look for in a company. Some things will be more important, and too many people skip reputation.
Absolutely.
Good. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
That's it, everybody. Hope it was helpful. If you have questions, come to the forums, and we'll be happy to help. See you there.